Right. So, as usual, my job is essentially to introduce the rest of the talks by other members of the development staff and try to create the impression that there's some kind of overall plan behind it all. I'm going to quickly review the strategy that we presented last year and then take a little bit of time out to talk specifically about user interfaces for a while. I think that's something that's on a lot of people's minds as technologies shift beneath us, and then get into some specifics of stuff that's coming in version 14 and other software that we intend to release over the next year or so. In an attempt to finish on time, there will be no demos in this talk, and also because the developers have essentially forbidden me from doing any because they want the opportunity to show you everything themselves. So I haven't been allowed to steal any thunder. So those of you who were at the conference last year may remember this slide. It's one I used last year. And in a sense, there is no need for this presentation because we're just carrying on according to plan as explained last year. Just very briefly, a little bit about what we've been doing. We divided the world into these 6 categories of things that we could, just to help us organize our thoughts. So in the last year, since the last conference on performance, Roger's been doing a large amount of work on primitive performance, so looking at primitive functions that could be enhanced, speeded up, new constructs. Jay, as Gitta mentioned, has been working on a new parser to take a higher level view and try and remove some of the interpretative overhead. The other sort of main push in the last 12 months has been portability, where of course the RIDE, the user interface that's going to allow us to move APL more easily to a large number of platforms, providing the same very highly productive graphical development environment for you on all the platforms. And then the MyServer, I think, can also be mentioned under this section because it allows you to build very portable user interfaces. Parallel computing, as Gitta mentioned, we sort of had 2 big pushes on that, the futures and isolates, which is the part where I get to play the developer and do a demo for you tomorrow morning. I'm very excited by that. The CodeDefense compiler that Aaron's been working on at the University of Indiana, where we've been funding some really left field, well, I don't know about left field, but it's really very much research. This is not something that we're about to release on you. It's something that will take time to develop. On the functional power side, as Gitta mentioned, we have version 14 is perhaps going to be one of the biggest releases in recent history in terms of new squiggles, new primitive features for functional programming in particular. On the side of providing tools for new people coming into APL, I think the most important things will be the sharp plot chart wizard that Nick has been working on, plus interfaces to the R statistical programming platform and the numerical algorithms group libraries. And finally, on application frameworks, we've been working, well, you could mention the MyServer again. I think that's going to be a new application framework for people building portable applications. And the cryptography library has been moving closer to an actual release. And I thought when we presented this last year, well, that sort of really divides things up very nicely into boxes. And then after the conference, a number of people came up to me, including Gitta, and said, well, but how does this actually help me provide user interfaces in the modern world? So I thought I'd take some time out today in this talk and spend a little bit more time on that and hopefully explain what our strategy, what our thinking is like on this subject. So I think everybody will agree that there are a lot of new opportunities for developing user interfaces, phones, tablets, etc. And I think we've clearly explained what the RIDE is. It's a development environment that helps you work on all these platforms. We also think there's a trend where more and more APL applications will actually just turn into services, web services, for example, where the APL developer isn't actually developing a user interface at all, but providing computational tools for the rest of an organization to use to build front ends in C# or Java or whatever. But there is no question that the majority of our users, I think, at least in terms of headcount, will still want to develop new user interfaces in APL. So not using two technologies, but at least in the early stages of an application, just a single technology. So if you're starting a new application today, the first question you need to ask yourself is, well, do I need native user interfaces on all the different platforms, or can I go cross-platform? Now, most of our customers today are, of course, targeting a single native platform, which is the Windows desktop. But if you need to move to some of these that we see at the bottom here, and you think that the market you're in means that you really have to have the native look and feel on each one of those platforms, then you're going to have to build one solution for WPF.NET, another one if you want to target the new Windows RT, Windows 8 platform. If you want to use a Macintosh, you're going to have to learn how to do Cocoa. And finally, if you want to go on Android or Linux and develop flashy user interfaces there, you're probably into some kind of Java. So if you have to do native, you have all these platforms that you need to address. On the other hand, if you think you need a user interface that will address all these platforms at once, and your user interface needs to be decent, but it doesn't really need to look exactly like a native application, then you can probably do that with a single cross-platform user interface. Using HTML, JavaScript, address all these browsers, and target all these operating systems in a single go. Okay, so if you're developing native user interface in APL, then first of all, we're talking a lot about new user interfaces, XAML and HTML and so on. I want to make it very, very clear. It is perfectly safe. If you think the target for your applications is Windows desktop, and I think that will be the case for a lot of you for many, many years to come, it's perfectly safe to continue using the Win32 API, Quad WC, which I think is in many ways the main claim to fame for Dyalog today, the reason why Dyalog has been very successful as an APL interpreter vendor. We will continue to enhance Quad WC as long as there is any significant interest in that. We're not going to walk away from it, and I don't think Microsoft is going to walk away from the Windows desktop in the next decade or two either. No matter what you hear, it's simply not possible. So we did a round of enhancements to that technology in the previous release, and if any of you come and say, well, we have to have this new Windows 7 or Windows 8 widget supported by Dyalog APL, we will do that. So this is perfectly safe. But if you want to take it, if you want to build something that looks really, really modern and you want to take advantage of round corners and translucency and animations and so on, then you are going to need to learn one of these new technologies. Windows Presentation Foundation, we think, is the one that looks most interesting today if you're on the Windows desktop platform. Over time, we'll probably add tools to let you build native interfaces on other platforms, but that's not the highest priority right now. We're still focusing mostly on Windows desktop when it comes to native interfaces. Cross-platform, we think, is something where a lot of users will want to go quite soon. Some people have already moved in that direction using the older APL as an ASP.NET scripting language. There are several production applications out there in the world today, of course. But we think that to go really cross-platform and not be tied into Windows as your server technology, we are going to need to provide a mechanism for HTML5 JavaScript. And the MyServer 3 is our attempt to provide a mechanism that will allow you to build decent interfaces in pure APL. Eventually, a Java bridge will allow you to perhaps use Java user interfaces cross-platforms, but that's not something that's at the very top of our list. One thing that's worth mentioning about HTML JavaScript is it's not a pure web technology. You can also use it on the desktop because HTML rendering engines are available on most platforms as COM components, .NET components, etc. And if you embed one of these in a desktop GUI, you can, of course, render HTML JavaScript there. So I did say there would be no demos. I'm cheating very slightly. There are a few lines of code here There's some mumbo-jumbo to say you want to use a piece of .NET, create a Dyalog form, embed in it a net control, which is a web browser. So we're taking a WPF component, in fact, here. No, sorry, a Windows Forms component, which is a web browser, embedding it in a Dyalog form, and then in this case, just not giving it HTML, but just telling it to navigate to its home page. And if you're Pete Donnelly, who made the demo, the home page is the weather for a Greek island. And you can see it's even better than here. So one of the things that the RIDE is going to do, I mean, the RIDE is really primarily a development environment, but it is going to host an HTML engine. So when you're developing on the RIDE, if you produce some HTML, one of the things you'll be able to do is have it be displayed by the RIDE. And what we're hoping to support quite soon, maybe in the first release of RIDE, maybe a little bit later, is that you'll be able to develop HTML, JavaScript-based applications in the RIDE, test them using the RIDE, then deploy them on various desktop environments using one of these embedded components, and then if you need a multi-user application, use the MyServer and use exactly the same application code to provide a user interface, which is then a web application that goes cross-platform. Another word that you're going to hear in several of the presentations today, which is related to user interfaces, is data binding, which is something that all the modern user interface technologies use, or are based around in many ways. And it's just a term that describes a direct link between some data in your application and the user interface, so a direct mapping. If you're using WPF XAML, you might see code like this. So here's the definition of a button, and there's a little thing that says binding path equals color name, and this is actually the name of a variable in the program, in the application program. So if you were in your APL code to say, well, the color name is red, the user interface would directly respond to that change to a variable. And that's something that we're looking at putting into Dyalog APL, both for the WPF and for the HTML JavaScript application. So you'll be able to take advantage of this, which is quite a big simplification in user interface implementation. And for properties that the user can modify, of course, if the user types something into a field, you'll see that reflected immediately in your application. So version 14 is going to add support for direct data binding for Microsoft.NET. And we're looking at a technology called Knockout.js, which is a way of communicating data between JavaScript and a web server to try and get this into MyServer as well sometime next year. Now, if you want to build a good-looking application, regardless of whether you go for WPF or the HTML5, you are going to need third-party controls. Because the basic WPF and HTML controls are really only, it's the list of 15 or 20 very basic things: edit fields, combos, drop-downs, and so on. If you want to build something, if you think it's a good idea to have a grid with a tree view in the first column and where the rows are shaded depending on the depth of nesting, you can't reasonably put that together from the base controls that are available, and you need a library that's going to help you do this. Much like the grid object in the Dyalog QuadWC system, you say there's a custom control there that has a very high level functionality. Now, fortunately, there's a very rich ecosystem, they call it these days, of companies who provide third-party libraries. You may have heard of some of these. These are companies that make WPF add-ons. And we were talking to some of our customers who were out trying to use third-party libraries with our .NET software. And we're getting into trouble that all of this software seemed to assume that you were inside Visual Studio and they had licensing code that was dependent on your project structure being within Visual Studio to validate that you had a license to use the third-party control. But then we talked to a couple of users, or we were fortunate to have a couple of users who we really respect, including Michael at the back, say he'd looked at this Syncfusion, it didn't have this problem. And we started talking to the Syncfusion people, and they were a very reasonable bunch of people to talk to. They're very pleasant to talk to, and they had a licensing scheme which was sufficiently flexible that we could use it. And they provide enterprise class components for a very wide variety of platforms. And we are very happy to announce that as of today, I guess, they'll be included in version 14. But if you're really keen to work in this environment, talk to us. We have the rights to let you have the libraries now. And for WPF, that's over 100 different controls, including some things that are not GUI controls, file format libraries for manipulating Excel documents, for example, without having Excel installed on a server. And on JavaScript, that's still very new technology for them. There's only about 30 controls there, but that's something we would expect to grow and get closer and closer to the WPF. And what this means to you is that you will have the right to bundle these in your runtime applications according to whatever license agreement you have with us. If you have an agreement with us, you can freely use these components in your application. So what's driving our emphasis on developing these technologies? We think that most existing APL applications really still need a single primary desktop environment, and they're going to need some cross-platform features. And our goal at the moment is to make it as easy to build these two types of applications with WPF on the desktop and HTML. Make that as easy to do as it currently is with QuadWC. That's the goal. I wouldn't claim that we're there today, but we're getting a lot closer with the new features that we can announce, that you will see in presentations later today. Okay, yeah, and we will go for the native, building an iPhone application and so on, but that doesn't have the same urgency for us at the moment. Yeah, and what I would ask you is that even if you don't think you have an immediate need for this, please do look at the new technologies that, primarily Brian, JD, and Michael are presenting at this conference, and tell us how close you think we're getting to this goal of it being as easy to use as QuadWC, because it's really important to us, I think, to get there so that new users of APL will find it easy to build new user interfaces. Right, but basically we're just following the roadmap. We're bumping along in our Land Rover or whatever it is. And business as usual. Oh, no, what's that? Well, there are a few obstacles on the way. We've been sidetracked by producing a Raspberry Pi version, which was released in June. And you say, well, we talked a bit yesterday in the robot presentation about how much work was involved in this, and can you justify spending time on this? I think it's been a very, very useful exercise for us in, for example, putting together this very, very easy installation system for Linux. So a Linux user can just type this expression from their command line and install Dyalog APL just like that on a Raspberry Pi. And generate some excitement and some new interest. And I think we do have some evidence that the things we've been doing with the competition and now the robot and YouTube videos is having some, together with other people like Bob Smith, who's working on NAS, having some impact. There is a clear increase in open source projects related to APL. So Bob is still doing his NAS 2000. This year we've seen 2 new open source APL systems, the release of GNU APL and a very, very exciting project by a Bulgarian who's built an APL interpreter in JavaScript so that it runs entirely within a browser. And then the work at the University of Indiana on the co-defense compiler, which, yes, we're funding it, but Aaron had gotten interested in this on his own before we started helping him focus. And at Iverson College this year, which is a gathering of mostly people who work on APL interpreters, we had a couple of very interesting new people from outside the community. Gianfranco, who's here to talk to us about test-driven development later this week, and Emily Beisch, who's a Python programmer and has written up, you might be interested to go and have a look at that link. She's written a pretty good piece on how that went. If you look at this in terms of numbers, our download counts. The Raspberry Pi version, that's, I suppose, a little bit under 1 a day since we released it. The unregistered version seems to be fairly stable at about 1,000 downloads a year. So personal users who actually paid money for the interpreters, about 50 for personal use, and educational licenses, 250. We can now see an impact of both TriAPL and the unregistered version probably stealing some of the educational licenses. People aren't registering for those anymore. And I talked to the guys doing the open source systems, and they gave us some numbers as well. So, there's a fair amount. It's probably some of the same people going around again. John's Game of Life video, now 100,000 views almost. You go and have a look at it this week, and it may get there. Where's John? That's fantastic. And this quote from Nick Nikolov, who did the JavaScript interpreter. If it hadn't been for the YouTube videos and TriAPL, I wouldn't be infected with array-orientedness today. And defans are really critical to this, because all the new kids who are looking at APL are coming at it typically from a functional background, and they see defans as a very attractive language. Traditional APL with global variables, not so much. Okay, so yes, we talked about Fiona. We now have a full-time technical writer, plus Pete still continuing to do as much work as he always did on the manuals. And part of this, short-term deliveries, the kind of thing you would expect, some new manuals. We've decided to document the R interface and release it finally. The reference card, which I think is stunning. But there's some more fundamental things that come from having a technical writer on board, some of them quite surprising. The last one there, standardization of terminology, no big surprise. User command renaming, we accumulated user commands from a wide variety of sources and just threw them in a big bag, but now we've taken the time to standardize their names and document them properly with Fiona's help. But this is a one-time. If you're worried about user commands becoming very unstable and all changing, that's not going to happen. This is a one-time event. The user command names will settle down now. But the new default migration level. So one thing is your technical writer comes to you and says, well, you call something X in one manual and you call it Y in another. We need to standardize the documentation. But what we found was every time Fiona started work on a new manual, she decided to put in half a page about migration level, the first couple of paragraphs in every manual, because she had struggled with that in the introductory course, and so on and so forth. So we decided, well, it's time to bite the bullet and make make a stand. So migration level isn't going to go away, but we're changing the default to 1 because we think that's, it's a very small change to 0, which means we don't have to make a lot of changes to our documentation, which is important. We don't have the energy to rewrite everything. So from 0 to 1 is really only this change that monadic epsilon means enlist, not type. So the statement is all new documentation will be developed in migration level 1, and there won't be all these comments about migration level, because we're thinking mostly of new users to APL. We don't want to infect their minds with this. So we no longer have a goal of eventually making migration level 3 full APL2 compatibility, the default. That's been in our manual since 1980. Well, since the beginning of time, where Dyalog released their first version, having read the IBM documentation, and then had IBM release APL2 with some of the features slightly changed a few months later. And that was the origin of the migration level thing. And we're still fighting it. However, having said that, migration level 3 will not go away. People who want to work in APL2 compatibility mode can do that. And providing full compatibility at the functional level with APL2 is a very important thing for us. So we've done a bunch of things in the last couple of releases to make, selector specification, missing access cases, put that all into Dyalog APL. So if you have an APL2 application, you bring it over into Dyalog APL, set migration level 3, it's just going to work. And we may also start looking at emulating some of the most important, most commonly used auxiliary processors to help people in this migration. Right, so John Daintree wondered what the ice cream cone was, I think, last year, because everything else had been traffic signs. And it's really just to say there's goodies coming in version 14. That's all it's supposed to symbolize. Gita has talked about all of these, so I won't spend much time on them. Other than perhaps to say that in terms of what you will immediately find useful, I predict key, which is a way of doing, if you have a lot of data, breaking it down by a key. It's like a group by statement in SQL. So it's an operator that allows you to take a large amount of data, break it down by a key, and apply a function to each one of the pieces. I think everybody has a function to do that, and you'll probably find if you use key, it's going to run 3, 4, 5, 100 times faster, depending on exactly what it is you're doing. And the extension to dyadic iota, where you can now do dyadic iota between matrices, and that is defined as a row find. And Roger will explain more about that in his talk. So that was on the language side, and sort of more on the system side. The important things are the Microsoft.NET data binding, primitive performance enhancements. There are also some quite significant enhancements to the component file system. And one thing that we're still hoping to sneak in before we release it is that it'll be able to run, APL will be able to run as a Windows service properly without using any additional tools or wrappers. Now, I wasn't going to talk about the details of any of these, but I got a bit carried away with the ice cream cone. So I thought I'd just talk about component files. One of the things that also, in addition to being nice, gives you a significant speed up is you can now read a whole bunch of components at once in a single statement. And that's much faster because we do less locking on the file and we read it all with much less network transactions. But Richard will be talking about this, so I'll just move on quickly. This image here is not correct because we compress the individual components. We do not compress the whole file. I'm running out of time now, so I'll just list these and leave that up there for. Roger's going to talk a lot about these speed ups that he's been working on. Key, we mentioned, this is a key here. The key operator is the quad equals. It's supposed to, the visual is that it's breaking the data up into groups. In the quad there, you can see the groups. And you can see there's some very significant speed ups here that Roger will be talking about. This thing here you may not recognize, that's a 2 train of functions. So this is iota 1, a top greater than or equal to. So this says find the first occurrence where x is greater than or equal to y. And because we can recognize it as a train, we can do that as a single operation. So that's one of the benefits of trains, is you get these larger blocks that you can much more easily write optimized code for. So the infinite speed up there is if the hit is early on in the vector, if it's the first one, we exit immediately. We don't do the comparison, where today in APL you would have to do the entire comparison and then go and look for the first one afterwards. Now, perhaps the most exciting features, well, from my point of view anyway, the futures and isolates. There's some features in the interpreter which we are labeling as experimental, which means that we are making them available as part of the official release, but you should be aware that they are likely to change. There's a good chance that they will change based on your feedback when you work on them. So the futures and isolates, which is an easy way for you to declare where the parallel sections are in your code, do parallel each, for example, and actually have it execute on separate cores, is something we're releasing. It's modeled in APL. We hope that you will look at it and give us some feedback, and then maybe in 1 or 2 releases we'll actually build them in as primitives. And J's parser, which will hopefully in version 14 be available, so that if you have simple functions of the form that it can sort of semi-compile, you can hit a switch and it will start doing that, but you can switch it off again if you don't like it. And sort of independent of version 14, Aaron's work on the CodeEfans compiler, I put it on this slide as well. It's sort of related, although this is not actually a part of the version 14 release. So what are we actually planning to release? Version 14 on the main supported platforms during the 2nd quarter of next year. And then we're hoping that Mac version, officially supported version for the Macintosh That's fairly definite, I think, and maybe Android as well. We're not quite sure about the Android, how much energy we want to put into officially releasing that. You'll probably have a version you can play with, but whether it becomes an officially released and supported version from Dyalog is perhaps questionable. The ride, on the other hand, I think we will want to see both on the Mac and Android, so you'll be able to at least use a tablet, an Android tablet, as a development device. The MyServer, there's sort of an official release date of the second quarter for version 3, but that's sort of an open source APL project, so that's on GitHub, and we're doing continuous releases of that, and take a look at it and give us feedback as you go. DFS 2.0, where the main new feature is that you can now take online backup and restore of your component file system without taking the system down, so you can operate continuously. In the first quarter, the interface to R also in the first quarter. And the interfaces to NAG and KDB that I'll be talking about on Wednesday are also sort of in the experimental GitHub. Use them as you will, and we'll be continuously revising those. Specifically focusing on new platforms, well, I've said that. Preview versions will be available earlier than these dates, so contact us if you want to get onto using APL on those platforms. One thing that's sort of been lurking in the background and hasn't made it onto the list, but is worth mentioning, I think, is that we recognize that we need to do some work in the very near future on essentially defining an official and shared project structure and distribution deployment mechanism for APL applications. So people who want to build an APL application, package it and ship it, perhaps encrypting the salted files, signing their application. That's something we'll be working on, at least a cookbook to explain to you exactly how to do that encryption. That's one of the things that Björn, the security czar, is going to be writing about. So, we're moving ahead, more or less as described last year. I think we can say that. No big changes. Of last year we were talking about not doing Silverlight anymore. We don't see any big shakeups at the moment. Things are moving more or less as we expected. The elevator pitch, which I've heard you're supposed to have. What's Dyalog working on at the moment? Well, we're working on mechanisms for XAML and HTML-based user interfaces, which are at least as easy to use as QuadWC. We want to put APL on all relevant hardware and software platforms. We want to continuously work on making APL expressions run faster and faster, and in particular take advantage of parallel hardware. And we want to also do the thing that nobody really wants to talk about, but which you're all going to have to face up to if you move into this web-based application structure. Andy? Oh, 5 minutes. Yes, well, I have a clock now, 4. Provide secure mechanisms both for data storage, so the cryptography library, maybe put encryption into component files. Maybe we'll do that. At least we'll provide you a mechanism for you to do that. We can discuss that. You can go and talk to Richard about what you think is a requirement. And if you want, well, we're in a single track format this year, so these slides are sort of superfluous. But just to quickly recap who's going to be talking about what. The performance side, Jay is going to be talking about his efforts to reduce interpreter overhead. We have a couple of customer presentations. Eugene Ying from Fiserv, who's done a number of presentations in the past, is going to do another one. The previous ones have been really, really valuable in terms of giving APL programmers tips on how to write fast code. Paul Grosvenor from Optima is going to be talking about some work they've done recently to speed up the Cosmos application, which handles vast quantities of data. And mostly Roger is going to be talking about the tuning that he's done. Most of the stuff about performance is tomorrow on Tuesday. And the same is true for the parallel. So today is the big portable GUI day. Tomorrow is going to be parallel and performance. I'll be talking about futures and isolates, and Aaron's going to be telling us about his Codefense compiler. The sessions on the new language extensions are all tomorrow morning. Roger's talking about rank key and related functions, and John about the function trains in version 14. Portability, that's sort of the next session that we're getting into now. John and Andy are going to be presenting the remote IDE in its current form. Brian's going to be talking this afternoon about the MyServer and building portable applications. Alexei's presentation doesn't perhaps belong here, but you could say it's a kind of portability, migrating to Unicode, twisting things a bit. And of course, Brian has a masterclass on MyServer on Thursday. So if you really want to get into the details of MyServer programming, there's a half a day on that on Thursday. For the new users, we have a whole bunch of sessions. I'm going to be talking about some interfaces we're building to 3 different systems: statistical package R, KDB, which is in a columnar database, extremely fast, also known as Q, and numerical algorithms group, numerical library. Fiona's going to be talking about and soliciting input on documentation. Aaron's going to be talking about how he uses APL to teach. And Nick has both a short presentation in the main conference and then a workshop on sharp-plot. The file server presentations, Richard's on at the end of today, and then I'm joining in with a review of version 2 of the DFS tomorrow. Dan on user commands, and Gianfranco is going to be trying to convince us all to use test-first development. Is that the latest word for it, I think? Right, and then today there's presentations by John and Michael on WPF. We're very happy to have Chad Church from Syncfusion. I don't know if he's arrived yet. Hopefully he will arrive by lunchtime. He's going to be talking to us about Syncfusion, the company, their libraries, their philosophy, so on. And then we have some really interesting presentations from customers focusing on user interfaces that they have built. Valentina from APL Italiana on the features that were added to the version 13.2 GUI and how they've been using those in their asset management system. Ilse from South Africa, you may remember, she did a talk last year about this application they were planning to build. They've now gone live with that, and she's going to give us an update on how that project's going. And then Thomas has an absolutely stunning video game written in, or at least controlled by APL for simulating driving a boat through the Finnish archipelago. It's a really beautiful application. And that's it. So thank you very much. Are there any questions? Please don't ask them before you have a microphone. Well, actually, Michael can, because he speaks loudly enough.
I'm only questioning, I mean, everything's very good. I'm just questioning why you made a decision on QuadML. Because with, for example, the up arrow being only really to do with take and the rest of it, it makes absolutely obvious sense that it should be first. And you should leave the enclose symbols with an index for enclosing. I don't understand why you've gone away from QuadML 3.
Okay, so the question is, why did we go for QuadML 1 rather than QuadML 3? And the answer to that is that you can make exactly the same argument about the symbols seen from a different, both sets are logical, and it's really a pragmatic decision. We would have to go through every single piece of our documentation and change everything if we were to go to migration level 3. Our user base is split pretty roughly down the middle in terms of people using 0.1 and people using 2.3. And it's
much more consistent using it the other way around.
That's a religious discussion. I refuse to. Take a vote. How many would have preferred ML3? Okay, and how many are really happy about 1 or would have preferred 0? Okay, well, I think there were slightly more in favor of 1, as I saw it anyway. Yeah, there was another question.
I was going to ask, how confident are you about 14.1 4.0 being released in quarter 2?
I am very confident. I think Richard is less confident. He's supposed to be managing the project. No, I'm fairly confident. No, we will do that. We will cut features, I think, if we can't release it. But is there anything in particular you're looking for, since you...
Well, yes. There's lots.
Everything, okay.
The GUI interface or the interface with MyServer. If we're going to jump there, I don't really see the point in jumping to 13.2 now. Okay. I might as well wait until 14.1.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm confident. You know, I wanted to stand here and give an earlier date, but I was told that was unacceptable. I think certainly by the end of the second quarter, we've got to get it out, or we can't go on holiday, summer holiday, without having released it.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that's it. Coffee break, and then we start again at 15:15. Yep. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much.